Hey everybody. So in this video, I'm going to go over the PowerPoint for Everyday Use by Alice Walker, which was the short story that you had to read for homework last week. I hope you guys liked it because I just love this story. I love Alice Walker, period. But go ahead and bring up our PowerPoint then. All right, so Everyday Use by Alice Walker. And if you don't really know who Alice Walker is, I mean, that's fine. She is, in my opinion, she is almost up there with Maya Angelou in terms of just overall greatness. Maya Angelou is mostly known for her poetry, but she did write prose. And Alice Walker is kind of the opposite. She's mostly known for her prose, like her novels and short stories, but she actually has written some really amazing poetry as well. But if you aren't aware, you may have heard of a book or movie called The Color Purple. It's also a Broadway show. And Alice Walker wrote that novel. It's so good. And she's a very prolific, wonderfully talented, inspirational author. So I was very excited that we have a chance to read some of her work here in this class. So when I saw that Everyday Use was there for us in the book, I had to have it on the syllabus. That was probably my number one pick. My easiest choice for the whole term was this short story. So it's one of those stories where it's very subtle in its impact. It's very easy to read this story and think that it's really not a big deal, that the plot is very tame and that there really isn't this big rising action and there's really not a big climax and it doesn't really seem like much of anything is really going on. It's easy to think that at first. You really have to get into the characters and look at all those literary elements to then really get the impact in terms of how important the message is in this story. But otherwise, it's pretty simple in its delivery, right? So that's kind of where we're going to start, is with structure, right? So as we're going through this, we're going to kind of summarize what happens in the story as well. So we have our exposition, which is where we, hold on a second. Shut my window. All right. So we start off with exposition. Remember, so that's just kind of like where the story begins. And we start getting a little bit of background information, kind of just setting the scene for us, right? So we know that, Mama is in the yard awaiting Dee's arrival, and Dee is her oldest daughter. She tells us a little bit about her yard, her house, both of her daughters, a little bit about herself, right? So we're just kind of getting a feel for the characters and who they are, how they interact together, a little bit of information about them, a little bit of information about where we're at, where the setting is, right? Then we have our rising action, which is when Dee and Hakeem arrive. And Dee is taking pictures. She wants the butter churn, and you can feel this tension beginning to build. And if you're really paying attention, you may have felt the tension before she even arrived. Mama kind of sets us up for that. But again, it's easy to miss. But once they're there and, we see all the interactions, the tension becomes more evident. So it really all hinges on Dee and Hakeem being there. Then we get our climax, which is where Dee wants the quilts and she assumes she'll get them. But Mama says no and ends up saying the quilts are for Maggie, the youngest daughter. And this was, again, it's very innocuous climax. It doesn't seem like a climax, but it is. It's actually a really big deal in this, for these characters that Dee has just asked for these quilts and expects to get them, and Mama says, no, they're for Maggie. We'll get into why it is such a big deal. All right, then we have our falling action, so the climax hits, and then it's like, okay, where do we go from here? Well, Dee and Hakeem prepare to leave, and Dee has a few parting words for Mama and Maggie. And then they are gone, and we're back to just Mama and Maggie being at the house. So we have sort of our resolution, our denouement, where, the climax has happened, the immediate aftermath has sort of resolved, and now we're just, riding off into the sunset. And in this case, Maggie and Mama aren't riding off into the sunset. They're chilling in the yard, right? They're just happily hanging out in the front yard once Dee and Hakeem are gone, and they seem pretty content for the most part. They seem unaffected by Dee's visit. I think that internally something has changed about Mama and Maggie, but at the same time, it did not disrupt their lives. They're just going back to pretty much what they were doing at the beginning, right? So all of this, again, it's a very traditional plot structure, but if you break it down, you can kind of see where it takes us. So where we start off, what that rising action is, and how you really got to pay attention to recognize the tension, and then it builds and then becomes more evident. We have the climax, which might not seem like a climax, but it really is. And then our falling action and our denouement happen pretty quickly. All right, so that is the structure of the story. Let's get into more impactful elements of the story. So, point of view. This is our first and only first person point of view that we're getting from the short stories that I've selected for us. So far, we've had, limited, omniscient, and objective. So now we get first person, because Mama is our narrator, and she is also a main character. So everything that we learn about these characters and the events that transpire, everything is filtered through Mama's eyes, right? She's very likable, right? She has a very unique voice. I don't want to say it's necessarily unique diction. It's actually a realistic diction, the way she pronounces things and whatnot. It's very, Alice Walker, she really wants to capture what a woman like Mama would have truly spoken and sounded like during this time and in this geographical location. She doesn't quite go as extra as Zora Neale Hurston does, and if you've never read anything by her, I highly suggest it. She is very much known for capturing the dialect of Southern America. It's very, very cool. Alice Walker kind of goes there somewhat here in this story with Mama, but everything about Mama is very realistic. It gives her credibility, it gives her believability. And so, while we only get her point of view, and we have to ask ourselves, anytime we have a first person narrator, we always have to ask ourselves, okay, can they be trusted? Can we trust this narrator? Are they really giving us the whole truth? Are they trying to cover anything up? Are they trying to make themselves look better than they really are? We always have to ask that with a first person narrator. And so with Mama, we should ask that as well. And what we sort of come to realize is that, yes, she is credible, she's trustworthy, she's believable. And the biggest reason we can go with that is because we sort of hear what she has to say about Dee. And on the one hand, of course, you can tell that she loves her oldest daughter. And in some ways, she is very proud of her oldest daughter, but she is not shy about pointing out some of Dee's character flaws. So the question then is, okay, how do we know that these character flaws are real? How do we know, how can we trust this? And the trust is confirmed once Dee arrives and we get to sort of see and hear this character as well. We come to, understand that Mama was right. She was correct. And therefore, our trust in her was valid. She's a very believable, very likable character. She is, she's a thinker, right? So she does a lot of thinking in that first part of the story. There's a lot going on in her mind. There's almost like this nervous energy preparing for Dee's arrival. And it kind of clues us in that we should be prepared for tension and conflict among these characters. But she's a thinker. She's also really funny. She jokes to us, the reader, like there's a lot. It's almost like she's writing, I don't know, a letter to someone that she is already very familiar with. Her narrative style, but as we're reading the story, she's like making jokes to us because it's not things that she's saying out loud to the other characters. It's part of the narrative. She is joking with us, the reader. Things like how Hakeem was trying to shake Maggie's hand, and she says, meanwhile, Assalamu alaikum is going through motions with Maggie's hand. It looks like Assalamu alaikum wants to shake hands, but wants to do it fancy. Or maybe he don't know how people shake hands. Anyhow, he soon gives up on Maggie. And then she laughs at herself. She makes jokes about herself struggling with Dee and Hakeem's names, right? And some might say that she's making fun of them, making fun of their names, but she's really poking fun at herself because she knows that she's not necessarily the smartest one in the room, the most educated in the room. And some of these things just are a struggle for her. But she doesn't let it make her feel bad about herself. She's able to sort of laugh and make fun of herself in those moments. She's very funny in these really subtle ways, but she's a thinker also. But more than anything, she is a very likable, very believable first-person narrator. And so we get to know her pretty well. All right, let's look at our setting here. So our primary setting is the Johnson house, Mama's house. Mama and Maggie live there. It's not their only home. We find out that they lived in another location that was ruined by a fire. And so this was a rebuild. And it's a very modest, meager house. We're going to look more at it in detail here in a little bit when we switch to the imagery elements. Let's talk about sort of the time period, that part of the setting. So we are in the rural South in the 1960s, maybe early 1970s. And how do we know that? It's never actually stated outright. We're having to pick up on some context clues here to figure this out. There is reference to pastures, which implies that we are in sort of a country rural setting. We're not in the city, right? There is a reference to Augusta, which would imply Georgia, right? Rural Georgia. And there's also a reference in the beginning to Johnny Carson, The Tonight Show, right? And that's where she's imagining that she's on this talk show with Dee, right? Johnny Carson. So, and then we know that this story was published in 1973. So that implies that the story takes place somewhere between the mid 60s to early 1970s, right? Somewhere around in there. So knowing that, let's think of some things going on in the world or going on in our country during that time period that might be affecting how the story is written, how the story would have been received, what maybe Walker is getting at with this story and the themes. Let's look at that historical context. So during that time, 60s to early 70s, many African Americans were really seeking to unearth their heritage and to redefine their place in American culture. Right? They were especially interested in elements of African culture that had survived and endured during American slavery. But slavery was still a very fresh wound, and we're, this time period, 60s to 70s, we're still in the midst of the civil rights movement. It's entirely possible that when this story takes place, certainly after when it was written, but even when it takes place, it's very possible that, we've already seen the assassinations of, JFK and Martin Luther King Jr. And, it's coming right after that, those pivotal moments, right? But it's still, still a very fresh wound. And that's why a lot of attention was turned towards Africa directly instead of to the Southern heritage, right? This is also the start of the Black Panthers, Black Muslims. It was an attempt to resist a white-dominated society, and it was promoting Black culture as a way to gain freedom and equality, and it was very much centered on that look towards Africa as opposed to that look towards the South, which makes sense. And I don't think we're going to get into how that historical context plays a huge role in this story. I don't want it to seem like Walker is trying to say that all of this was bad, because Dee does not necessarily come off in a good light in this story, but it's not because of her joining this movement and turning that attention towards Africa. I don't think Walker's trying to say that's a bad thing. It's really that dynamic between Dee and her mother and sister where sort of the critique comes into play. But this historical context is a big part of who Dee is right now. Right? Okay, so let's take a look at the imagery. We have, there's a lot going on in this little teeny tiny house. So we have imagery of the house, right? And the yard and the things in the house, right? So the yard comes first. That's where Mama is when the story starts. She says, I'll wait for in the yard that Maggie and I made so clean and wavy yesterday afternoon. It's like an extended living room. Your living room is where you go to relax and spend time together as a family. And for Maggie and Mama, it's really the yard that does this. So when the hard clay is swept clean as a floor and the fine sand around the edges lined with irregular grooves, anyone can come and sit and look up into the tree and wait for the breezes that never come inside the house. The breezes that never come inside the house. So being inside the house is a little more stifling, whereas the yard, you get that breeze, you can breathe easier and still relax. And feel free. The house, just 3 rooms, just like the one that burned down, except the roof is tin. There are no real windows, just some holes cut in the sides, like the portholes in a ship, but not round and not square, with rawhide holding the shutters up on the outside. We've got a cow, right? When Dee's taking pictures, she never takes a shot without making sure the house is included. When a cow comes nibbling around the edge of the yard, she snaps it and me and Maggie and the house. So Dee's attention is very much drawn to the house and the things in sight, right? So we have the butter churn, right? And Mama says, you didn't even have to look close to see where hands pushing the dasher up and down to make butter had left a kind of sink in the wood. In fact, there were a lot of small sinks. You could see where thumbs and fingers had sunk into the wood. It was a beautiful light yellow wood from a tree that grew in the yard where Big D and Stash had lived. This butter churn is made from the wood of a tree that was in the yard of Mama's sister. And that wood was used to make this butter churn, and this butter churn has now made butter for a very long time. Our attention is very much supposed to be drawn to items like the butter churn. And then there's the quilts. They had been pieced by Grandma D and Big D, and then Big D, and me had hung them on quilt frames on the front porch and quilted them. One was in the Lone Star pattern. The other was Walk Around the Mountain. In both of them were scraps of dresses Grandma D had worn 50 and more years ago. Bits and pieces of Grandpa Gerald's paisley shirts, and one teeny faded blue piece about the size of a penny matchbox that was from Great Grandpa Ezra's uniform that he wore in the Civil War. So there are items in this house that that are described to us with the use of imagery to draw our attention to those items. Our attention is drawn to the house, and we know that D is very much drawn to the house, but Mama and Maggie, they prefer the yard, right? So we know that, what Mama focuses our attention on shows us that it's that they live a very simple, if not downright meager life, her and Maggie. And her use of imagery and describing the surroundings also show us these household objects and how they are connected to memories and family history. Super important. We also get a lot of imagery with the characters, right? So we've got this, these different descriptions of Mama, what we learn about her, what she knows D wishes she was like. Here in that first part where she could, is imagining being on the Johnny Carson show, what she knows D wishes she was like. But in real life, I'm a large, big-boned woman with rough, man-working hands. In the winter, I wear flannel nightgowns to bed and overalls during the day. I can kill and clean a hog as mercilessly as a man. My fat keeps me hot in zero weather. I can work outside all day, breaking ice to get water for washing. I can eat pork liver cooked over the open fire minutes after it comes steaming from the hog. One winter, I knocked a bull calf straight in the brain between the eyes with a sledgehammer and had the meat hung up to chill before nightfall. Right? She is not what Dee wants her to be, or at least what she thinks Dee wants her to be. But she is strong. She is able to do hard work, and she is proud of it, and she should be. And it seems as though she is a single mother. Don't know how long it's been, but there's not much mention at all about Maggie and Dee's father. I don't know. It's a big question mark. I'm not sure what we're to make of that, but certainly he is not around now. She is a strong, hardworking, single mother who can easily do the physical work that a man would typically do. And, I'm sure if we were to close our eyes, we could probably imagine what she looks like and be pretty accurate. And all the more reason to just love her as our first person narrator, right? But not necessarily glamorous, and that's not necessarily what she thinks Dee would like her mother to look like and present herself as. And we have Maggie. Maggie is nervous. She's very meek and small and shy and self-conscious, not well educated, and she seems to have always lived in Dee's shadow. She is very educated, very glamorous, very outspoken, very outgoing, assertive. She is the exact opposite of Maggie, right? And so we have some examples here from the story that Mama shares with us. Maggie will be nervous until after her sister goes. She will stand hopelessly in corners, homely and ashamed of the burn scars down her arms and legs, eyeing her sister with a mixture of envy and awe. So we know that the house burned down, but we know that Maggie has burn scars. So clearly she perhaps got the worst of that house fire, right? She thinks her sister has held life always in the palm of one hand, that knows a word the world never learned to say to her. The mom, so this is again Maggie through Mama's eyes. So Mama thinks that Maggie is very nervous and is going to be nervous until after Dee leaves. And Mama thinks that Maggie has always looked at Dee with a mixture of envy and awe. Mama thinks that Maggie thinks that Dee never gets told no, right? And then she has another description here of Maggie. Have you ever seen a lame animal, perhaps a dog, run over by some careless person rich enough to own a car, sidle up to someone who is ignorant enough to be kind to him? That is the way my Maggie walks. She has been like this, chin on chest, eyes on ground, feet in shuffle, ever since the fire that burned the other house to the ground. We have, Maggie's a very sympathetic character through all of this. I looked at her hard. She had filled her bottom lip with checkerberry snuff, and it gave her face a kind of dopey hangdog look. She stood there with her scarred hands hidden in the folds of her skirt. She looked at her sister with something like fear, but she wasn't mad at her. This was Maggie's portion. This was the way she knew God to work. This is getting into when, Dee asks for the quilts and assumes she's going to get them. Maggie assumes Dee is going to get them too. This is just the way the world works. So she is a very sympathetic character, and it's very clear from what we hear from Mama, that Maggie is very small and meek. She's very self-conscious, has always lived in Dee's shadow, is very nervous, and somewhat envious of Dee, but doesn't appear to be angry at Dee about it. It's almost like she doesn't blame Dee for being who she is. Maggie just thinks this is just the way of the world. This is just how the cards were dealt. It's very interesting. She's a very interesting character. And the only time she ever comes close to speaking up for herself is when she drops the dish and slams the door when she hears Dee asking for the quilts. That's a pretty important moment. We have Dee, who is the exact opposite. She is lighter than Maggie with nicer hair and a fuller figure. Dee talking about when they were younger, Dee wanted nice things. A yellow organdy dress to wear to her graduation from high school, black pumps to match a green suit she'd made from a suit somebody gave her. She was determined to stare down any disaster in her efforts. Her eyelids would not flicker for minutes at a time. At 16, she had a style of her own and knew what style was. She had a few friends, furtive boys in pink shirts hanging out on wash day after school, nervous girls who never laughed, Impressed with her, they worshipped the well-turned phrase, the cute shape, the scalding humor that erupted like bubbles in lies. She read to them. But even the first glimpse of leg out of the car tells me it is Dee. Her feet were always neat looking, as if God himself had shaped them with a certain style. Anyway, she just has this description of when she gets out of the car. Dee comes out next, a dress down to the ground in this hot weather, a dress so loud it hurts my eyes. There are yellows and oranges enough to throw back the light of the sun, earrings gold too, and hanging down to her shoulders, bracelets dangling and making noises when she moves her arm up to shake the folds of the dress out of her armpits. The dress is loose and flows. Her hair stands straight up like wool on a sheep. It is black as midnight around the edges. Around the edges are two long pigtails that rope about like small lizards disappearing behind her ears. We get fantastic description of Dee. Right? She is, very proud, very confident, very strong-willed. She is educated. She's almost exotic, like she's out of place here. She is a stark contrast to Mama and Maggie in every way imaginable. Both her appearance, her style, her personality, her level of education. It is almost like they are from totally different worlds. And where we're at in this story is Mama and Maggie's world. And it does not seem as though Dee belongs there whatsoever, but yet that is where she's from. It's very interesting. Right? But that contrast is there for a reason, and it's to highlight what is happening among these three women in this family dynamic. So our symbols in this story, I said we'd come back to a discussion about the yard, because the yard is a symbol in this story. It's where we begin and end the story. Mama describes how she and Maggie have prepared the yard, in anticipation of Dee's visit. Mama says that she prefers the yard to being in the house because the house is stifling, right? She says that the breezes don't, make it through the house, right? So both figuratively and literally, the house is stifling. But the yard is freedom and control. The yard is a safe place, right? But the most important symbol by far are the quilts, right? So when Dee comes back, she makes a big deal about a lot of things in and around the house. And it all culminates with her asking for these quilts and expecting to get them. But it kind of surprises Mama and Maggie that Dee would even ask for them in the first place. Like, why would she even want them? And what does Dee say? That she's going to display them. And that's when Mama's like, what? No. Like, you use them. Just like, because Dee is concerned that if Maggie gets the quilts, she'll just use them. Mama's like, well, what else would you do with them? That's what they're for. So the quilts become a symbol of that stark contrast between Dee and Mama and Maggie. They represent, if you remember, like they are made up of different pieces of fabric that are from pieces of clothing worn by family members of previous generations. So those quilts in particular are like living pieces of history. And family history. They are, but even the ones that don't necessarily come from pieces of clothing, the whole process of quilting in this family, right? Learning how to quilt, being taught, then making your own quilts, passing that knowledge to the next generation. It is a symbol of family heritage and generational bonds, right? it is also a symbol of their resourcefulness. It is made pretty clear that that Maggie and Mama aren't necessarily living a lavish lifestyle, right? They seem on the poor side. So using scraps to make what is needed is a very resourceful survival mechanism. And it's important to recognize it. But Dee just wants to preserve and showcase these quilts as symbols of cultural heritage. She doesn't necessarily see the familial bonds and the intention behind the quilts. But Maggie, not only does she understand the deeper meaning of the quilts, but she's actually able to continue the legacy. She knows how to quilt. Dee does not. And she probably was never interested in learning how to. But yet here she is wanting these quilts, claiming that they're so important and need to be displayed. But Maggie's the one who fully understands what these quilts are and how to continue that legacy and make them on her own. So yes, the art is a symbol, but really the quilts are the big symbol, the most impactful symbol. So that brings us to our themes. What themes are we looking at in this story? And I think, again, part of figuring out these themes for this particular story is looking at the contrasts among the three characters, because it's very clear that education is a theme. It is, Mama spends a lot of time making it clear to us that she and Maggie are not well educated, right? And I've given you a few examples of where she's done that. And then a very big deal is paid to how Dee is educated, right? And a few more examples of what Mama says about Dee being educated. So we have the two women who live in this house who are not well educated versus this character, Dee, who grew up in this area but has since left and become well educated. And the difference between these characters is like night and day in every way, but education is emphasized quite a bit. And so what can we make of this? Here's our analysis. Education is a good thing in theory. You know, her Mama's focus on the yard and the house and how it's a very meager existence. Her focus on the contrasts between Maggie and Dee and telling us how they save the money, how they raise the money to send Dee to school. Like, it is clear that Mama realizes the benefits of education. But education mixed with pride and arrogance isn't necessarily a good thing, because the entire encounter with Dee, her entire visit, culminating with her asking for the quilts, shows us that despite her education, Dee still has much to learn. She didn't know where any of these things came from. She didn't know whose pieces of clothing. She didn't know where the butter churn came from, the tree that they got the wood to make the butter churn. She doesn't know who taught who anything. She doesn't really understand these symbols of family and heritage. her assumptions have led her to a place, and not just assumptions, but I mean, there are reasons for it. But again, she thinks that she knows better than Mama and Maggie, and that looking towards their African heritage and displaying symbols of that, whether it be through changing your name, how you wear your hair, what you dress in, what you display in your home. All of those elements for D point towards Africa. All of those elements from Mama and Maggie point towards their actual current heritage, which would be their Southern roots. And it seems what is being said is that, education does not necessarily mean knowledge, and that to be truly educated, you have to seek knowledge, but you also have to accept things outside of your own worldview, so that you don't alienate other people. Dee just seems to think that anything associated with her true roots, with Maggie and Mama, the only thing worthwhile about any of that heritage is something that could be put on display. And she doesn't really understand that, whether she likes it or not, this little house with her mother and her sister is part of her heritage too. Right, which takes us to the second thing. Heritage, right? Dee's family history to her, it represents oppression, and of course it does. It's something she desperately wants to overcome or maybe just forget. So she constructs a new identity, a new heritage for herself. She changes her name. She adopts a specific style of her appearance that seems to celebrate African culture, but not her Southern American heritage, right? She rejects her true heritage. She wants the butter turned in the quilt so she can display them as artifacts. She doesn't even remember any of the facts. She does not understand, let alone appreciate the intrinsic value to their everyday life. But Mama and Maggie, the Johnson family history might not be fancy or pleasant, but Mama and Maggie still respect and celebrate it. To Mama and Maggie, the quilts are just steeped in, it's all about family members whose garments were used to make them and the family members who did the quilting work. Mama knows that Maggie should have the quilts because Maggie understands and respects the quilts, Mama says, and she will use them in the spirit with which they were made. That's pretty much why Mama makes that decision. So our analysis is Dee claims that Mama and Maggie do not understand their heritage, which is laughable because it's Dee who doesn't understand her heritage or doesn't want to acknowledge her heritage. Maybe that's not the right way to say. Maybe it's not a matter of understanding, right? You have to acknowledge it before you can figure out if you understand it. And it seems like she doesn't even want to acknowledge it. But understanding and respecting culture, heritage, and tradition does not require these things to be put on display or removed from everyday use. Our title, it always says, look at the title. It'll help you. This title is everyday use. And we know that comes from, the disagreement about the quilts, because Dee thinks they should be hung up and preserved and shown off like artifacts. And she just thinks it's absolutely crazy that Mama would let Maggie have the quilts because Maggie will put them to everyday use. And when she says, Maggie will just get, Maggie will use them. She'll put them to everyday use, and then they'll, start to fall apart or whatever. And Mom was like, okay, then she'll just make new ones. She knows how. Like, it is really beyond Mama to understand what Dee is talking about, what she's trying to get at, because she's not, she and Maggie aren't seeing these items as things to be put on display. They're a part of their everyday life. And I think you can see both sides of this. But if we're wondering which way Alice Walker is leaning, I'd say she leans a little more towards Mama and Maggie's side. I feel like perhaps there was a part of her that was at one time much like Dee, and then who knows what happened, but she then comes to realize that, while everything about the historical time in which this takes place, it makes perfect sense, looking towards Africa and acknowledging those roots and celebrating them. That's not a bad thing. It's simply that you're ignoring this whole other part of your heritage, of your culture. And you really can't just pretend like it doesn't exist, even if it's painful. It's still, you still have family roots, family history in this area, right? Yes, celebrate the African roots and make that your main identity, if that's what you want. But that doesn't mean that you can forget or ignore the true living family history of where you grew up. And that's what Mama and Maggie represent. That's what the quilts represent. So there is a huge statement being made here about heritage and how Dee's current view of her heritage is not necessarily the right view to take. And maybe Mama's and Maggie's isn't fully either, because maybe they should allow Dee to teach them more about their African roots. Maybe there needs to be this middle ground. Maybe that's our goal. But certainly, if we're looking at where these characters are right now, Mama and Maggie seem to sort of be on the favorable side, whereas Dee, like, I'm sure you are a wonderful young woman, but you still have some things to learn. Even with as well educated as you are, there's still a few things you need to learn. Hopefully she does. But it certainly doesn't seem to faze Maggie and Mama at all once Dee leaves. They just slip right back into their routine and the comfort and security of their life that they don't view as negatively as Dee does. All right, so that's it for the story. Again, I love it so much. I hope you guys liked it. But again, remember that the keys to this story, a lot of it lies in the setting, especially the historical time period in which it takes place. the imagery and what we learn about the items in the house and what we learn about the characters. Right? And then, of course, the symbol of the quilt, for sure. All of that is working together to sort of show us that sort of minor theme about education and then the more major theme about heritage. If you have any questions, reach out. Otherwise, you're free to go ahead and move on, and just know that, a lot of this is going to show up on the short stories exam in week 10. So if you have any confusion, definitely reach out. Right? Otherwise, go ahead and move on.